PvP skill difference is going to increase and not decrease with these changes. That's true in PvE as well. I think the skill gap in PvE is going to get much bigger in the expansion. Why will it get bigger? So just kind of ignoring all of the, you know, like what is raid content gonna look like, and like the simplification stuff, which again we found out is just massively overblown. At least speaking of raiding, add-ons and weak auras combat related did a lot of lifting to make you better. And I guess just pretty simply, the less good you are as a player, the more those things helped you be better, right? So the skill difference between the best players in your raid and the worst players in your raid, and the best players in the world and the more average players and guilds and all of those things, the gap should... I mean, I don't even understand an argument really of how the gap wouldn't be bigger. It just will, because those things were things that everyone used, and just objectively, those help you more the less good you are. The best players are the ones getting the most nerfed. Okay, explain that. I'm not even saying you're wrong. I'm wondering what angle you're coming at. Like, I think the best players are getting the most nerfed would make sense if, like, I think that is the only way you could think that is probably if you are just fully buying the fake news that like the game is getting way simpler and like classes are getting a lot easier. Because that, I mean, that was just pushed majorly over the last week. So I mean, if someone believed that, it wouldn't be because they're stupid. It's because that's what people were saying. More accurately, the most average players doing high-end content are getting nerfed the most. I need to think about it for more than like 5 seconds, but I believe that is the case, yeah. Scripe came at it from the angle of worse players were not able to utilize the add-ons to the same extent that you guys are. That is a good point. W Scripe, that is a very good point. That is a very, very good point. I mean, I can't fully relate to that, but I can tell you that, like, you tune into some guild progressing the raid, and you see them using your weak aura pack, and you see they have, like, 6 weak auras enabled for that boss that are not relevant, they don't need to track, but it's just on their screen, and they're, like, basically, weak auras done well are there to, like, efficiently give you information. But for a lot of people that don't take time to actually, like, make sure the weak auras look good for you, all of our weak auras have a bunch of custom options that make them bars or icons or do whatever you want, ignore certain conditions based on how you take the information, and our players heavily update that. But if you just rip the liquid pack just straight up and you just like trust that it all works, that's not really, you're not making weak auras work as well for you as they could, right? But also, I think one thing recently that has been really good, and I believe this is done at an average level, does people in your all's guilds use liquid reminders or some kind of reminder tool where you can set your own reminders based on the fight? That is something that I think has actually started to do quite a lot of heavy lifting. Like, that is really helpful to all players. In fact, unless the boss specifically requires a weak aura, I actually think that does a pretty big amount of lifting. And that isn't going anywhere. That's just still in the game. Reminders work just fine. So maybe the reality is, which would make all of the reaction this week pretty comical in hindsight, is that the game's going to feel like pretty fucking similar, except they're just not going to make a weak aura boss for like at least a couple tiers where you would have felt like you needed a weak aura for it, which is something they've actually done before on accident. Like, we've just done raids where there wasn't a weak aura boss. People are going to use the shit out of reminders now. I mean, you wouldn't use reminders any more now than you used to. It doesn't replace anything that is now gone. The stuff you would have wanted to remind yourself before would be the things you'd remind yourself for now. But yeah, I mean, reminders are sick. You are certainly at a disadvantage without them, I would say. Which actually makes me think of something. Whenever Blizzard is like adding things to the game, making other stuff not work, you have to ask yourself the question, did this get removed because they think it's bad or because it's collateral damage with things they actually want to be gone? So let's ask ourselves that with reminders. Do they think reminders are good for the game? Like, it's not currently removed. Like, for example, you have to ask yourself, do you think Blizzard would ever put reminders in the game? I don't know if they would ever do that, but I don't know if reminders are bad for the game. Like, if you're just some random person doing your weekly raid night on a Saturday and, like, you just want a reminder to press your major raid cooldown, like, Aura Mastery like 8 minutes into a fight. But yeah, you don't have to remember exactly when you can do it. You could have a little reminder tell you for shit like that, you know? Like that, there's nothing, I don't think that's bad. Like, I don't think Blizzard would dislike that. I mean, it's probably a reason they don't remove it. Max, do you think it's a coincidence that a lot of the hardest bosses have been bosses that weak auras couldn't carry you on? No, not really, because there's been some of the hardest bosses ever have had, like, weak auras do one, when people are talking about weak auras being annoying, aren't they always talking about exactly one thing? They're talking about a mechanic that requires people to go to a specific spot, and what the weak aura does, is it assigns everyone a spot rather than you having to figure it out via voice. Can anyone think of another scenario of like weak auras are playing the game for you and it's literally not doing exactly that? Like that is it. That is the bit. Now, as long as you're talking about things that haven't been removed from weak auras, like the Archimon weak aura or Star Augur weak aura, but those don't exist in the game because they made them not work anymore. So like that is it. That's just a mechanic you cannot make. You can make a hard boss without that mechanic, but if it ever has that mechanic, you used a weak aura for it, and you know what I'm saying. They can also still be really hard. Like, do you guys remember Jailer P1? Dude, Jailer P1 with it telling you which place to take your bombs was still hard as fuck. But that's because Blizzard knew that you would be able to, this is the whole arms race thing. Blizzard knew you would have a weak aura telling you where to go, so they made it like that. For example, if a weak aura didn't tell you where to go, instead of having 3 seconds to dunk your bomb in the hole, you would have had like 6. That's how like an alternate reality version of that mechanic would have looked like. Like clearly they designed, a Brood Twister, you would have had 3 or 4 more seconds to find a spot than the amount of time you had. The reason it was the way it was they have to find a way to challenge you, and they know you have these tools, and now they don't, right? So they can still, yeah. Wouldn't reminders be okay in Blizzard's eyes? Go against their new philosophy of not wanting any add-on to grant you an advantage in combat? Yeah, kind of, but it's like, what kind of an advantage? Like, they don't want you solving mechanics for you. It just depends on, like, basically you'd be saying, okay, having boss timers gives you an advantage in combat, because if you have a boss timer, you can see when a mechanic is going to happen. But, like, they're okay with that. So they built it into the game. The question is just, like, whether they're going to build reminders into the game. Not going to lie, the Dispel weak auras are overrated. If you know the Dispel is happening, it's obvious. Spell target frame glow is more effective. Oh, yeah. No, I mean, there's two. No, I think Dispel weak auras are pretty huge. Like, specifically the ones where, like, people press a macro to be dispelled at the right time. Or, like, let's say there's 4 dispels that need to happen, and it just simply, one weak aura that we always make is, like, if we have 4 healers and there's 4 dispels that need to happen, just so they don't waste any globals, we just assign each healer to dispel a very specific person, and, like, their frame will glow, and they know exactly who the person they're supposed to dispel is, not anyone else. That actually reduces a lot of Kagi load for healers, which are already is the hardest role in raiding. So I think that's something. I think healing might, but they also made healing a bit more simple. So like maybe that was also targeted at like you're not going to have those anymore. That's also a mechanic you can not make or make easier to handle, right? Like, is there still going to be mechanics where you need to dispel people at an exact time when there is no dispel weak auras? Like, it's the same thing as the jailer bomb thing. Like, you just might design it a little differently. Like, you might not have to dispel them at the exact same time, or maybe there's 3 instead of 4, so like everyone goes for the dispels, and if one person misses, it's cool, but like that's the way you do it now, right? Disc Priest with no cell, ramp reminders, and no PI weak aura. But I mean, that's why they changed Disc. They made Disc Priest significantly easier to ramp on now for that exact reason. Yeah, actually, that's one thing that would majorly... Like, dude, as a melee, having a sound that plays when a mob is doing a frontal, and I know I can go into every dungeon, and if the mob is frontaling, it makes a sound, and I immediately know there's a frontal in the pack. Stuff like that. In raiding, it could be every time there's a big AoE, you play a BAM, or every time you get fixated by something, you hear a boxing gong. Things that have you've... It's, again, just efficient flow of information. I believe you will be completely unable to do things like what I just said. That is not possible. Basically, all that information is within the black box, and you cannot get it. You can't know that that a frontal is happening because it's in the black box, right? But also, what they said is in their dungeon design, they want it to be significantly more obvious when any of those things are happening for that exact reason, so you don't need to see a sound. Right. Which is admirable and will definitely take some work over time. But I feel like this is a problem that's less of a thing now because that is something they have accurately done, right? Like, they set out a goal this expansion to make mechanics more clear. And I think it's inarguably true that they are. Mechanics are just simply more clear now than they used to be. I mean, couldn't you add this to, like, the dungeon journal in a way? Like, isn't there a world where in the Blizzard UI... Like, you open up the Dungy J, and you're scrolling through boss abilities, and one of them says Shockwave, and it's when a boss casts a frontal. And then you can right-click that boss thing, and you can say Add Sound, and it'll do Ding 3 when that thing happens or something. Like, I feel like that's something like what the Dungeon Journal and the boss reminder in-game thing looks like 3 years from now.